Let us begin. My name is Yoichiro Mori. I'm the host for today's plenary session. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jane Wang, who is our plenary speaker today. Jane received her PhD in physics from the University of Chicago, and after a postdoc at Oxford and NYU, she became faculty at Cornell, where she's stayed ever since. She's a professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering and physics. Jane is a fellow of the American Physical Society and is a recipient of many awards and honors, including the NSF Career Award and the David and Bill Packard Fellowship. She has been a leader in fluid structure interaction problems and biofluid mechanics, and I'm excited today to learn about her work on insect flight. Now, if you have questions, please jot it down in the chat window, and at the very end of the talk, I will go through the questions and ask them. Depending on how much time we have, I may be able to ask you, the audience, to ask questions directly. So please, Jane, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Yoshiro, and the organizers for inviting me. And I would say this online conference, I've been enjoying it, and I suspect it might be a mode for future ones. So let me start by saying that it's going to be a broad overview of our work on insect flight, and that comes from many people in my group and in collaborations. And what I want to do today is mostly trying to explain to you why I would, essentially the title, why would I think it's a good way to understand insect flight from starting from the physics of flight and gradually make our ways in understanding its neurocircuitries for flight. So I want to start by, now it was working before. Okay, by showing you a video of a dragonfly falling upside down. And as you can see, dragonflies are four-winged insects. And in this brief video, which lasts about 200 milliseconds, what the dragonfly does is it's being released from an upside down orientation. And as you can see, through the coordination of the four wings, eventually it rights itself quickly, right? So, so the question is, how do we understand what's actually going on in their mind? Mind is a big word, but what is the entire process from perception to action? And so now, broadly speaking, you can think of, well, somehow they recognize that they are being held upside down, they're falling upside down. And there's some innate reflexes that they've evolved and allow them to send instructions to the motor neurons, and the motor neurons then activate the corresponding muscles, and those muscles actuate, they would adjust the wave motion, and the wave motion will then interact with air and to generate aerodynamic forces and the torques, and that will lead to the desired body rotation to right themselves upside down. And so in this case, this is a fairly long sequence of events, and as you can see that much of this is hidden from us, and so what we see from the videos are their behavior. And now it's interesting also to think about what kind of mathematical descriptions we can have at these various processes. And as you know, there are lots of people work on each layer, and there are different mathematical models one can do. Now, one thing special about all these descriptions is at the very end of this chain of reaction, if you wish, is the body rotation, wave motion, and the air. And that part of the physics, it happens to be describable by a set of first principle laws, and that is aerodynamics, which are governed by Navier-Stokes equations, And you have the wing and the body coupling, and that's governed by the Euler equations. And so these are the things we can start with, but in the same time, that also implies whatever is happening before that, start from the perception all the way to the end, must obey or must be constrained to these set of physical laws. And so that's the general mindset that I like to take when analyzing animal behavior. And that is, whatever when we're looking for a mechanistic explanation of a behavior, it'll be good to bring some of these basic large physical constraints into our understanding. And so that's where is a natural place for us to start to analyze this. So it's a long trajectory start from understanding the unsteady aerodynamics of flapping wings and start to make our ways in connecting to understanding of muscle actuations and perhaps also all the way back to insects' sensory motor system. So the rest of the talk is giving you some idea how we went about this and what kind of findings we got in terms of combining both sort of mathematical analysis as well as experiments. So the general idea is, put another way, is that this is essentially a picture for what I just said. That is, on the left-hand side is what we love. We know the laws and we like to know what the solutions are. And on the right-hand side is what people can also measure internally when you probe a specific neurons, and that's what you get. And often at the level of the neural activity, people trying to give a phenomenological models to say what is going on and what the rate's about and so on and so forth. And I guess in the back of our mind, these two things should be connected. Right, so it's it just has to be, because that's how animal works. And you might have already saw various talks on insect flight, and certainly foremost are from a biology community, and people are interested in neural behavior of animals. And more recently, robotics has become very interesting, making small flying machines. And so these are inspirations for those aero vehicles. And another big picture that I like to keep in mind is that I think it offers a perfect a system for us to understand the evolution of living organisms. And insects are one of them, in fact, the most abundant species on Earth. And it's one of the oldest living species. And so looking across a time span, for example, dragonfly was evolved about 350 million years ago, and looking this entire range of a time span, and then see how they diversify and how they find solutions to flight. I think it will be tremendously interesting and offer lots of clues to the evolution of living organisms. Lots of work have been developed in different fields. And there's lots of exciting technological development coming from neuroscience. For example, there are lots of initiatives of mapping the entire connectome of various of animals. And for example, flies is a good model organism to be mapped. And there are also new optical techniques that you can measure the activity of neurons during behavior. For example, flies walking. And there are also direct neural recordings of the muscle activities in these tiny little organisms. So these are all tremendously exciting. And in the same time, there's also the behavioral space, the kinematic space, that is one of the, of course, the key function of flying animals is the behavior, the flight behavior itself, and how they maneuver in space, how they navigate, and how they understand their orientation in space, just like us. So all of these should be tied together someday. And at the moment, I think there are enough technical challenges at each end, and so lots of questions are being addressed, technological ones. But I think everybody is aware of all the other fields. In other words, a person who's working on neurons and certainly will be interested in behavior, and likewise for us who are interested in behavioral space and be very interested in understanding what's going on from in the mind and in the brain. And so we are starting from the behavioral space, and what I want to say is that we like to go as far as possible inward and making some predictions and deduction about the internal behavior, and that might shed light on some of the measurements that people are doing internally when they probe the neurons. Okay, and one of the interesting things I want to mention about insect flight is that they're incredibly small, well, compared to birds and others. And so it's actually very difficult to simultaneously measure the neural activity during their free flight. So this is a future direction everybody is trying to push to, but at the moment, it's still very difficult to measure them while they are flying. So these are optical images, as you can see. They already are able to do some of this, but to directly measure different parts of neural circuitries is still a challenge. So part of our job is trying to connect these pieces that are measured under different circumstances, but trying to make some sense as a whole. So this is really going back in history. When I started out, as Yoshiro is mentioning, at Quran Institute, I was in a math institute, and there was no insects in the building, and it was New York, and there was no insects around except occasionally you find them on the pavement outside New York City. Once I did actually find some dragonflies, which was not doing so well because it was lying on the pavement. And so much of all thinking about insect flight, it was a fairly conceptual and abstract, but there was a value to that. In other words, one of the things we often find when you analyze a complex system, as many of us are doing here, is there's an overwhelming amount of complexity and interactions. And so sometimes it's essential, not only sometimes, but it's always essential to extract the most, the key pieces that we can have a possibility of understanding, and that provides an essential entry to this complex organism. So that was my first attitude, and that is, I would like to take everything away. That is, take their brain away, take their muscles away, everything. You stripped everything else. Now what's left? And what's left is an interaction between a piece of wing and air. Okay, so that was the problem I was trying to study. And so that problem can be also characterized by a simple experiment. You basically drop a piece of paper, and there you go. You don't do anything, and yet it looks like as if flight in air, right? So that's the essential piece of physics that characterizes a flight. Flight means that it stays in air, it goes from A to B, and in this case, it doesn't fall straight down, but because of the air, and emerges this periodic, in this particular case, a periodic tumbling. So it's a periodic motion going from up right corner to the left. Now that's already a very interesting problem, because the governing equation for this is interesting, and also the Reynolds number associated with this particular piece of particular phenomena is about a couple of thousand, and so that is in the intermediate range of Reynolds number. That is neither a potential flow, nor is it a pure viscous flow or Stokes flow. So in itself, it requires us to understand the Navier-Stokes equation in the unsteady regime at this intermediate Reynolds number. So that was the gap I was trying to understand. And so here's the equation, as some of us are familiar with. That is, the air is governed by the Navier-Stokes equation. On the left, you have m, which is rho times a, the acceleration of fluid. And on the right is F, and that is pressure force plus viscous force. And it's also an incompressible flow because the flow speed is fairly small, a couple of meters per second. And now what makes this interesting already, of course, the unsteady Navier-Stokes equation itself is interesting, but what makes even more interesting is the fact it couples to a dynamic boundary. In other words, this piece of paper itself is governed by F equal to ma and Euler's equation, but on top of that, it's coupled to this unsteady flow that exerts aerodynamic forces. And the way that these two systems are coupled is through this no boundary condition. And so part of the initial effort is trying to solve this set of equations. Now, one way to start thinking about this is to start to think, well, let's approximate. This is a two-dimensional wing. And people say, why do you say this? Because real insects are 3D. Of course, we know that. But nevertheless, it's very important to think about what's actually happening in this idealized situation so we can make progress. And also, and it will give us an answer that is whether insects can fly in 2D. Okay, so these are the equations, and many of us, or many people I suspect in the audience also work on computational methods. So here's the one that we used, which is you solve for the 2D Navier-Stokes equation around this moving boundary, and because you have a single moving boundary problem, so we can translate this into a non-inertial framework. And a couple of sort of a tricky spots we'll have to pay particular attention. One is very sharp leading and the trailing edges. And so there you can use a conformal map to resolve them. And the other is at a far field, and when on computational domain, you have a finite computational domain. How do you come up with a accurate far field boundary condition that even though it's imposed locally on the finite grid, but it actually approximates what you expect at infinity. So those are the kinds of things we had to worry about. And so this was solved using a vorticity stream function formulation. It was in fourth order in space and time. So that was our initial entry. And then this is a little bit of a digression to what I'm about to say, but nevertheless, this family of problems raise an interesting computational challenge, and that is, how do you solve multiple particles interacting with unsteady aerodynamics, unsteady fluid in Navier-Stokes equation, be it they can have arbitrary shapes, and they can also interact with each other closely. So this turns out to drive us one line of research, which is trying to come up with computational methods to solve this. And lots of people familiar with immersed boundary method, and some of you might be familiar with immersed interface method. And so these are a set of algorithms that we developed trying to improve the accuracy and efficiency in resolving this. And so that the idea is not only the particles need to be prescribed in motion, but they actually can be freely moving, coupled to the forces acted by the surrounding fluid. And so if people are interested in this, and this is sort of an area can use further development, and in terms of applying these methods to various applications. So that's the fluid and structure interactions that Yushiro was mentioning earlier. So these are the computational methods, and they essentially solve one part of the problem in this very complex animal locomotion problem, and that is the wing and fluid interaction. And these are the sort of just give you some idea about what the flow is like. Of course, there are lots of vortices being shed, and I was looking at this so many times. And of course, one of the things I was looking at this yesterday is you realize that when this wing is falling, and it always trying to push it in a way that is with least resistance. In other words, with a very small angle of attack. And so this is a natural behavior. And also, and just by a small change in terms of geometry, if you make this plate to be much thinner, or this ellipse much thinner. Computationally, it's much harder because you have to resolve the very sharp edges, but dynamically also goes through an interesting transition. Now, instead of a periodic tumbling motion, it now has this flutter motion. And so now you can imagine that this plate interacting with fluid is already capable of generating a variety of motion. So that was an interesting point for us because we can now use this as a way of studying the relationship between the kinematics we observe and the effective force laws acting on this. And this turns out to be critical. So we spend a lot of time on understanding how the plates fall in quiescent fluid and compare with computation. And we came up with a set of reduced order descriptions of the forces and the torques on these moving plates in a fluid at intermediate range of Reynolds numbers. And these are the aerodynamic forces models we will use and have been using when we study optimization problems, for example, energy minimization, as well as for control problems that we'll be talking about. And so this is sort of a quick sort of a overview of the first part, which is the physics of fluid and the structure interaction. So now you can imagine that here's a piece of paper, nature has that, let's say, and seeds, for example, is a planar, has a planar geometry. And if the seeds is falling from a tree and if over the course of evolution and it gets to optimize its shape, what shape would it choose? Of course, you can look at this exact seed's shape and they are quite a diverse forms. So one of the seeds that most of us are familiar with is a maple seed. In this case, now here's a maple seed. It has a wing, almost looks like a dragonfly wing. And if you drop it, and it will spontaneously gyrate, right? So there's something special about the exact shape and the geometry of this and the mass distribution of this. And so it falls into this nice steady gyration. And all it does is just altering its own geometry. So the point I want to make here is not so much exactly how it transitioned to this gyrating mode, which we studied, but here's another interesting sort of a surprise that I had. That is, I was thinking, well, if the wing is so important, let's see if we can alter the wing shape and what will it do? So if I cut just a little bit of the wing shape, and it seems to have no trouble to fall. Now, if you're a biologist, you say, wonderful, that's a robustness of an organism. But from a physics point, you might ask, why is that? And then you say, well, if the wing is that important, if I cut the wing, what do I do? And now if you cut most part of the wing, it's still gyrating. So that's an interesting mechanics problem. But what it brings up I want to emphasize for this talk, is that this incredible, seed is not only just having this nice, beautiful gyrating mode, but it's incredibly stable. So it's stable in the sense you can alter almost all the wings, which sound a little strange, but it still has this mode. But of course, if you keep cutting just a sliver more now, it will not gyrate. So there indeed is a transition, but that transition happens when you lose almost all area of wings. Okay, so that's plants. And it has an advantage for a stable mode because the idea of the seed or the job of the seed is to disperse. And so if it can remain in air for a very long time, it's good for dispersion. So one quick justification for having stability is that it allows them to be dispersed over a long distance. So now we get to the problem of the insect. And so now if you have a little fly, which has also two wings that's not unlike the maple seed, and plus a body. And if you make them flap back and forth, in this case, forward flap and backward flap symmetrically, and you'll realize that that little bug is not stable. And this is a problem, of course, faced by airplanes, birds, and I would say almost all insects. And so there's a fundamental instability in this, that is, two-winged insects are unstable. So it's not, in this case, it's not just because we happen to use these particular geometry, particular morphology, or particular wing motion, and it is a generic, this is a generic feature of flight. So plants are stable, but bugs are not stable, and most bugs are not stable if there's no feedback circuitry. But it is possible to make it stable, and this is the rest of the talk, or at least a big part of the next part of the talk that I will describe. So if you allow the wings to adjust based on what it senses as its body orientation, it is actually possible to stable this. And so what insects are doing, they are actually equipped with a large array of sensors, and they manage to very cleverly monitor their own orientation. And if they sense they're falling forward, they'll do something to correct themselves, even though we don't actually notice them. And these wing adjustments happen to be extremely small. And so that is an interesting puzzle for us to solve, exactly what wing adjustment is needed to stabilize a fly. These are the kind of things the computational tools will be very helpful, because in experiments, actually, these subtle wing motions are very hard to tease out. And so that was my big sort of at least I thought it was a nice realization, that is, seems like in the world of plants, they prefer stable design, and in the world of animals, they might prefer unstable design. And that might have some evolutionary implications. But nevertheless, what I'm trying to say is an unstable design in insects go very well with the fact that they have evolved a set of neural circuitries for flight. And so by understanding the stability of a fly, that might give us a sort of an entry way to understand the neural circuitries for flight. So in order to do that, we have to expand the model that I was describing before. Before we had a fluid and a wing interactions, but now in order to understand stability, one also has to take into account the wing and the body interaction. That's governed by the Euler-Newton equations. And on top of that, the wings must adjust in response to the body. And so that there we need to design a feedback control algorithm. And so to do this, we wrote a sort of a dynamic simulation tool that leads to the kind of animations you saw earlier. So I skipped this part, but to say what kind of answers are we able to find about the sensing and the feedback of a fly during its stable maneuver from these computational studies. So I skip this. And I might skip this too. If people are interested in this, you can also read more about this, that there's a generic physical mechanism for the kind of pitch instability I was talking about. So pitch is in the direction of a forward leaning and a backward leaning. So these are the questions. So in order for themselves to stabilize in air, what do they need to measure in terms of the body states, and how would they react by adjusting their wings? And can we say something theoretically on the time scales associated with these two kinds of process. One is sensing, the other is reaction. So in order to do that, first we have to convince ourselves that we actually have a system. This is before we really convinced that they are unstable. And so what we did is to carry out a stability analysis of the system. So you have a simulation of flight, and from that you can identify periodic orbits. And the periodic orbits can either be ascending flight or descending flight or forward flight or backward flight, whichever you choose. And in this case, it's a four-dimensional space as in the longitudinal plane. And then once you identify that periodic orbit, then you can analyze the stability of it by finding the eigenvalues of the monodromy matrix. And so there is something one can find out, and indeed, in this case, where we looked at the translation along the vertical direction, and you realize that both hovering and ascending flight are unstable, and only when you fall very fast, about 40 centimeters per second, then it can become stable. So they can fall unstably, but eventually that falling motion itself can become stable. So for most of their normal functions, one would say that they're not stable. So to adjust that pitch instability, what you can do is you pitch forward and backward. When the body is pitching forward, you might want to exert a torque that moves the body back, and vice versa. How exactly you're going to do this, and you can move. So this is to the right is a top-down view, and so you can imagine by breaking the symmetry, that is, you lean the wings also forward, or shift the stroke center forward, and that would shift the pressure center forward, and that would create a torque, net torque, that pitch the body up. And so that's the essential algorithm. But you can do this, or you need to do this, at least we think it's appropriate to think about this as a discrete time delayed scheme. That is, the insect's actually measuring, but doesn't have to be continuous, but they somehow get information every 1 beat of every 2 wing beats, and so on and so forth. And then you allow them to think a little bit. That's the time delay. And then they will say, okay, now I like to shift my stroke forward or backward by this amount according to that algorithm. And so now we already introduced 2 time scales. One is that how often they measure every wing beat or every 2 wing beats, and the 2 is time delay, which is how fast they think. Okay, so one we call TS, the other is TD. And so then it becomes a sort of a measurable thing from the computation. So we can do a systematic study to say, well, now I have 2 parameters. Let's look what's going to happen, or find out whether this insect can stabilize itself in this 2-dimensional phase space spanned by these 2 time scales. And this is the question that we were addressing. And the graduate student, Song Tang, and he did this lots of calculations, and here's a 2,500 simulations, which is meant to find out when this bug can stabilize itself. And so broadly speaking, you have 2 regimes, and when the time delay is less than, say, 3 wing beats, you find, yes, you can have a possibility to stabilize themselves. But moreover, if you sense more frequently, you can tolerate a little bit longer delay, and that seems to make sense. But interestingly enough, you'll see that this regime is the blue regime. It contains not that many integers. In other words, so the blue is good in this case, and so the most blue is toward the lower left corner. And there you have to sense every wing beat, and if you shift away, that's about 2 wing beats, things okay, but once beyond 3 wing beats, not so good. So 1 beat or 2 beats are both reasonable for insect to sense and react. And it seems to us that whether it's 1 wing beat or 2 wing beat, it's actually an extremely fast sensing rate. 1 wing beat for a fruit fly is about 4 milliseconds. And so these are calculations based on the geometry and morphology of fruit fly, which weighs about a couple milligrams and flaps at 250 hertz. And so we are saying the sensor should also sense every 4 milliseconds. And now that's very fast. And we didn't know very much about the neuroanatomy then. And we are aware there's a lot of literature on it, but we didn't read very much. So I was very puzzled that is it possible to have such a fast sensing rate? Has people discussed about this? Are we saying something that is only computationally true? Okay, so that led us into the neuroanatomy literature. And so we said, okay, flies, according to this, if you believe it, you say it will be good for them to sense every wing beat to stabilize flight, right? Now, stability of flight is something very hard to study experimentally, because they are naturally endowed with all the senses that act. The feedback system is always acting. So it's only in computation you can actually strip them away and say, okay, that's unstable, and then put little bit pieces of a feedback back, and little by little you can study them. So that was a good thing for us to look into, because we now have such a tool to study this. And so then throughout looking through a little bit more into the literature, and we also made this conjecture that is one of the steering muscles, and now it's called the first basilar muscle, B1, is critical for regulating pitch stability. That wasn't clear at all in the beginning, but now I explain how we eventually conclude this or made this conjecture. So this led us to look into inside this thorax and trying to have some appreciation for flies' equilibrium reflex and the muscle motor system that allow them to remain stable in air. And so what's very special about these Diptera, and many people, you might have read this in literature, that they actually are 2-wing insects, unlike 4-wing insects, and so that's why it's called a Diptera. So the 4 wings are used to generate aerodynamic forces, but the hind wings are no longer hind wings, and they are reduced to little tiny, like a pendulum stalks. And so they're extremely small. If you don't look for them, you don't see them. And but what they do is they beat back and forth just like a pair of 4 wings, and except it in a 180-degree counterface. And now what's their roles? And so that was a very interesting, actually historical, very interesting puzzle. And the people first noticed this in 1700s. They cut them and say, well, what are they good for? Well, if you cut them, they don't fly. And so it is obviously very important for a fly, not exactly why they're important. It took a very long time. And around the 40s, people in the late 30s and 40s, Pringle and others start to make various conjecture to say what they are good for. And one of the leading candidates, which turned out to be a very good candidate, and I think most people now believe that these are acting as gyroscopic sensors. So they beat up back and forth, and notice that they are well attached to the body. So when the body is rotating, and that beating stalk, it's like a Foucault pendulum. A Foucault pendulum is beating back and forth, but if the Earth is rotating, at the root of this pendulum, it will experience a Coriolis force. And that Coriolis force is proportional to the rotational rate. And so that was the idea that they can actually use these to detect their rotational rate. And for everything I said before, in order to do this feedback system that to correct the pitch instability, you do need to measure the pitching rate. And so this will be a great way to measure the pitching rate. And this is also a great way to measure the yaw rate. And in fact, you can measure all three angular velocity. And that was a little bit of a missing part in the literature, but and I did show here that it's possible. So as I was reviewing this literature, I wanted to convince myself that they actually can detect both, all three components, rho, yaw, pitch. And here's an algorithm that I think it will do. So that's a wonderful sensor flies have. So in principle, they can sense them. And this is also an interesting sensor because you notice it doesn't go through the vision and doesn't go through the rest part. And so it's really a local mechanical sensor. So given that the fact these are direct sensors right next to the muscle, they can immediately send signal to the muscle via just one or two motor neurons. And that's a perfect candidate for the fast neurofeedback circuitry that's needed for controlling stability. And so let's look at this a little bit more. And so I mentioned about the fly muscles. Flies also have an interesting sort of architecture about their internal muscles. And there's a division of labor. So they have big muscles that power the front wings, but on top of that, they also have very tight, well, relatively small muscles. They regulate the hinge of the muscle, these wings, and these are the ones that are called a steering muscle. In other words, if you need to turn, and these muscles will act. Okay, so the B1 muscle I was referring to is one of many of these, muscles. And so I start looking at the literature, and so I didn't know B1 at all. I just looked at the literature about fly muscles. And the fly muscles, one of the earlier paper that talked about B1 and also brought this to our attention is that the earlier works where people actually directly record the neural activity of four of those dozen also steering muscles. And one of the things Hyde noticed immediately was that, well, of these four muscles, one muscle behaves rather unusually. That is, it fires every wing beat. So all these steering muscles, by definition, you would imagine they are active when the fly is trying to turn. Now here's a strange muscle. It's called a first basilar muscle. It is active even when it's not turning. So I don't think we had much other insights. And as soon as you saw this, the immediate conclusion is, aha, wouldn't it be nice? B1 just fits our story, or fits our conjecture that it is actually active because it's there to help with flies' stability. And so hence our conjecture that B1 could be the primary muscle that help with flies' stability. And there's a lot also work from Dickinson's group where they've actually compared measure the B1 muscle and also compare the wing strokes. And there was interesting correlations with what the wing is actually doing compared to when in relation to the activity of a B1. And turns out one of the feature of the wing adjustment happens to be this forward and the backward shift that I was talking about earlier. So all of these, at least you can say they are consistent with our thinking. That is, here is certainly a candidate. So when we wrote the paper, we basically said, here is a possible candidate and for such a feedback circuitry that's needed for fly stability. And of course, you can now also look for other muscles for row stability, but that was back when, quite a few years ago. And so, so what do people know about B1? There's actually quite a lot of progress early in the 60s. Most of these findings coming from mostly just anatomical studies and not much being said about B1, B2. And I specifically look for a first bestseller, it says not known. But there are actually a lot of works, more recent works, that shows that there are various, more than just B1, there are other muscles also have this tonic firing. So that makes me think there are these, you know, a collection of muscles, B1, whether B1, B3, depending on the, they could all participate in the correction for pitch and row instability. But this was actually after the other encounters I had. So the other encounter I had before seeing these new, more recent experiments on muscle activity was when I was at Janelia on my sabbatical. And because we had these theoretical guesses, I guess, and so one of the obvious next thing is, do people actually know how to test this? So I asked if they can actually alter the B1 muscle in one way or another. And so one of the exciting development in neurogenetics is that they know all these genetic tools. They can silence specific motor neurons to various muscles. And I just didn't know whether they actually have a way to silence the motor neurons to this particular muscle, which is B1. And so I was led to a postdoc there, Troy Sharangi, and he happened to be playing with B1, the motor neuron, for other reasons. And the one thing he hadn't looked was, he didn't look yet what the flies do. And so I asked him for these flies, and essentially put them in front of a high-speed camera. So this is the first vial I got from him. And you can see they're still sitting in these classical tubes. And this is the one that does not, that's been altered. That is, he did something to alter the circuitry of the motor neurons to the B1 muscle. So the prediction would be they won't be able to fly. And here's an evidence that the flies do have trouble to recover. And so that was very sort of exciting moment when I was looking exactly in front of my the high-speed video camera and to see this. So now, of course, you can say, let's see what normal flies do. Well, in the normal fly case, they also walk to the top of the tube, and they also fall just like the other ones. And when they fall, and this is the picture B, they manage to stabilize their pitch and then land to the side of the tube. And so there is a comparative study. Now, when you have a batch of flies, of course, everybody has a little bit of a different amount of activity because experiments can be so precise. So it's good to look at the statistics. So statistically, you can also start to quantify what proportion of the population can recover by looking at certain metrics. And you realize that indeed the two populations are very different. And another way to quantify this is to say, well, I can look at the pitch direction, and here's a visual way to show that, yes, only on the right group, you will see the actual head is pointing down. And so they, in fact, the ones that was B1 knocked out, they will undergo a complete full rotation, which no normal fly would do. So this at least is our evidence, experimental evidence, to show that it's consistent with our conjecture that B1 muscle.
You like driving names?
Okay. Did you say something? It's about time to remind me. I see. Okay, so here's just putting everything together, and that is you start. So we started from the lower end. We looked at the stability analysis, and this now gets us to connect to this literature of flies equilibrium reflex, which really goes back to almost 200 or 300 years ago, and I think this is an example what I was referring to earlier, that it might now be possible that we can start with physical modeling of the physics of flight and say something about the internal control schemes. So I was being reminded over time, so let me look. It's 1:51, and so I think I was told to stop now, and so what I will do is just quickly say that we now worked out a similar or another example of dragonfly, which was the first thing I showed you about the writing reflex in connection, in collaboration with Genelia. And I will skip lots of it, but maybe get to the very end. This is another example that you start from observe and measure these kinematics directly, and trying to extract something about their muscle actions and the perception of their falling upside down state. And I'll skip all the analysis and will show you that we now have at least 2 systems that we've analyzed in this manner. And the idea, the key to connect the perception and observed behavior is through the analysis of their dynamics, and that dynamics gives us some insight about their muscle activity. Their muscle activity is the first link into their perception. So I will end here. So this is reminding you that pathway I showed before, and finally say what I mean by from Newton's law to neurons in the evolutionary context. And so you start from gravity, that's the foremost physical force around us. And then you also have fluid. So I had a fluid and gravity interaction in the case of falling paper. And then the world has seen plants, and that's older than insects. And then we have dragonflies, that's about 350 million years, and flies about 250 million, and more recently birds, and so on. So that's all, in a way, is partly explained to you why I say it is actually from physical laws to neurons. Okay, that's all I want to say. And I'll be happy to take questions.
So thank you very much, Jane, for the really very interesting talk. So if you have any questions, please place them in the chat box. Otherwise, maybe I can ask a question. So can you you went through the slides very quickly at the very end, but can you tell us give us a very short synopsis as to what happens with dragonflies with 4-winged insects? So you said in 2-winged insect case, these muscles that you found, that you identified, control this instability. In the case of the pitch instability, in the case of 4-winged insects, what happens?
Yeah, so quickly, that in the case of the 4-winged insects, in this case, all the 4 wings have to coordinate themselves. And so what happens is you realize from this mixture of the wing adjustment, it turns out in this falling upside down recovery, it is that they are actually using the wing asymmetry, which is the wing pitch asymmetry between the left and the right. And if you then find the wing pitch asymmetry, and you say, okay, which muscles might regulate the wing pitch asymmetry? What are the upstream pathways to this? And so little by little, and surprisingly, I stumbled upon again, a set of literature which points to the vision of the dragonfly. Turns out it is actually the vision plays a critical role in the perception of the initial falling state.
I see. So it's in the case of dragonflies, at least, it's the vision that is correcting, or the
the vision is the perception. But what's
right. I understand. Sure.
Yeah.
And the feedback can be then longer, I guess. I mean, vision is not a very fast thing.
Longer, yes. And the dragonfly also are much bigger insects, and so their wing beat frequency is about 30 to 40 hertz. So, so yeah, yes. In this case, it takes much longer. It's not an inertial sensor as in the case of Diptera.
I see. So maybe another question. So you also showed hummingbirds at the very end in your So is it so these are also I mean, birds are all mostly, I guess, two-winged, and hummingbirds stay at one place. Do they also have what they do? Is it completely different, or do you have any idea?
Well, I'm not expert on this, but for birds, one of the very important things, as you can see actually in this picture very clearly, the tail fin is actually doing something. So they actually play a big role in pitch stability. As you can imagine, that's what the insects are also using. And I have no doubt they will adjust their wing motions in response to their sensory perception, in this case, vision and among other things. And sure, they will have to do a similar set of feedback circuitries, feedback loops in order to stay stable or maneuver. Yeah.
I see. So now you also mentioned stability. So you also just mentioned the word maneuverability. So is there I guess I don't know very much about flight, but I would imagine that stability and maneuverability are somewhat kind of opposing kind of things. So if you are more stable, it's maybe less possible to maneuver yourself. But if you want more maneuverability, you might be sacrificing stability in some sense. Is there such a kind of a trade-off among insects?
So that was partly my point. In fact, when I show the slides between plants and animal, and that was kind of that point. In other words, plants, because they don't have the ability to actively control their trajectory, so they evolve into a stable regime. But for animals, and one way to overcome that stability, or one way to increase their ability to navigate in air, and they can exploit that instability boundary. So they actually actively, dynamically evolve toward the unstable regime, but in the same time, they also have to co-evolve a set of neural circuitries to help them to both be stable as they needed, and as well as to maneuver. So they're not contradiction at all once they're in that dynamic interface.
I understand. So are there insects that are less maneuverable, less stable, and things like this? Does this depend on different insects?
Okay, so that is a large question, meaning that, so this is also kind of tied into my slide, which I said, well, that would be very nice actually to study the evolution of insects in that sense. That is, they have about 350 million years of history, and lots of lineages, depending on who's counting, it's from 2 to 10 million species, and there's certainly lots and lots of behavior to be analyzed. And so to have a general answer, no one has a general answer yet, but that is something one can certainly, it will be worth looking into, and we are looking into them.
I see. It was very, very interesting. So we're at 2 o'clock. So if there are no other questions, I guess there aren't. So let us thank Jane again. So I'm not going to unmute everybody so that we can hear all the clapping. But well, Jane, thank you very much. This was a wonderful talk, and I'm sure the audience really appreciated all of what you had to share with us today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Shiro.
Thank you, Jane.